So what is a position of relative strength for the Ukrainians at the negotiating table?
Position of strength is Ukraine is in a position where it has all of the weapons to blunt any kind of future Russian advance.
Could we see such a thing actually happen?
So there's a non-zero chance that something like that could happen.
What he wants to do with the United States, isn't that concerning enough for you?
Presidents don't really have that much power.
What should people pay attention to, in your opinion, for the rest of this year or in the next short to medium term when it comes to the war in Ukraine? Not the disinformation. What should people look out for that Ryan Macbeth gets gets its seal of approval from you? In the sense
look for the F-16s. That's definitely going to be a big one because the F-16 is basically it's a 4-threat weapon. You can also fire those HARM missiles at jammers. What are jammers? Jammers are emitting electromagnetic radiation. What does the HARM do? It's an anti-radiation missile.
This is the Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. It is Piotr and it's the Global Gambit. If you're new here, this is a show that looks at the nexus of geopolitical risks to the global macro and reconsiders the West's place in this multipolar world or not. And someone who has a great time doing that, I think, in the sense of he's often debunking and diffusing many a thing to do with disinformation, which comes out of some overzealous anti-Western or anti-USA kinds of things, is Ryan Macbeth, profound, prolific YouTuber, an analyst, software architect, cybersecurity guy. I'm basically reading off his YouTube description, but he's a great chap who's been kind enough to join the show before, and we're very glad to have him back. Ryan, nice to see you. Have you lit up your cigar yet?
Oh yeah, I'm one step ahead of you there, bub.
There, I heard it go. So we're having a slightly less formal conversation today, though the severity of the topics are just that. But I'm giving a cheers to Ryan with my own glass of wine here, which tastes more like apple juice. This is YouTube, so I don't think they mind alcoholism on the internet. But Ryan, you keep a track of almost every, I think, military front there is possible, from a sort of disinfo and just trying to keep things on the straight and narrow. Yesterday was one of the most, I think, unpleasant recent events. We're recording this on Tuesday, July 9th. So yesterday it was July 8th, when there was a massive missile strike against not just a hospital, but a children's hospital. Given that neither of us were there, but can you take us through your perspective about that as someone who sees so much information that's coming out that's claiming it was Ukraine doing it as self-sabotage? And also, why would Russia do this at this time?
Well, I think that part of the reason that Russia wanted to execute that strike today is that it coincides with the 70th anniversary NATO meeting that's going on in Washington, D.C.
75th.
I was actually invited to... yes, so there is a meeting going on in Washington, D.C., and I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is about 2 blocks away from Washington, D.C. And so I was actually invited to a dinner. I wasn't invited to the conference, but I was invited to a dinner after the conference. So I guess maybe I'm moving up in the world, right? But I think that Russia wanted to make a point with NATO meeting in Washington, D.C., that they can cause trouble inside of Ukraine whenever they want. So I think that was kind of the geopolitical idea behind that particular strike.
One of the things that has been obviously a core debate, well, not really a debate, but people have been trying to provide mis and disinformation about the fact that it was Ukraine because they were using a US-provided missile. Most people agree, from what I've seen, I'm not a military analyst, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but most people agree it's a KH-101 cruise missile that was launched because of the fins, the shape of the head of the missile, the way that it was angled when it was coming in. Obviously, these are blurry photos, but from your analysis, from what you've seen, where are you leaning towards? Not necessarily to K.
So I don't know whether this particular missile was a KH-101 missile. However, I can say what it's not. That's actually pretty darn easy. One of the things that kept popping up on the internet was this wasn't a Russian missile. This was a Ukrainian NASAMS missile that hit this particular hospital. And that is those are words that a person can say. But in this particular case, people tried to take a look at this particular missile and then kind of match it up with different pictures of missiles. But the problem with using video off of Twitter is that Twitter compresses stuff so much that you're really losing a lot of the features that you would get if you're using the uncompressed video. So it's really dangerous to use Twitter for any kind of comparison. Now, what you can do is you can look at the actual crater, new crater analysis. And I can tell you that a NASAMS missile with a 40-pound, or I think it's 18.1 kilos for countries that haven't been to the moon, those kinds of weapons would not cause an absolute collapse of a building and also have debris strike another building. So we're looking at a 1,000-pound warhead or 450-ish kilos, which would be roughly what is on a KH-101 missile. So I can't prove from pictures that the thing that struck this particular hospital is a KH-101. I can say it is likely the thing that hit this hospital had a 1,000-pound warhead, and that would be more indicative of a Russian cruise missile than a surface-to-air missile that fell back to Earth.
Actually, on this point, something that I found very, very entertaining just before we joined one another was a thread about there's an account which I won't name, but I don't want to give them a sort of a shout out, but they were claiming that because they had put together, I will share the imagery and the subsequent commentary from people who actually know what they're talking about, that because they had stuck some popsicle sticks in the side of like a mold that they made or something, that they knew that this was obviously definitely not a KH-101 and it was some kind of Western missile. It shows you the extent that grifters will go online, I think, to sort of prove a point, but sort of be absolutely bizarre in that they undermine their own point. Very funny. But another example I'm actually very interested in your take on was the events in Crimea about 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. We had Jake Bro on again, a friend, colleague of the show, and he was giving his perspectives on the missile and the interception by Russian air defense on because it was meant to be going for Berbeck Air Base, I believe, and it ended up over the beach, which is between two military facilities. Yeah. What were your takeaways from that?
Are you referring to the ATACMS, the supposed attack on some beachgoers with an ATACMS missile? Is that what you were referring to? So that was most likely an interception, and I say that because a lot of people don't understand this. That the way I would phrase this is: imagine every time you opened your mouth to breathe, you lose a little bit of blood, right? Mm-hmm. If you were going to do that, you would be very careful about when you're choosing to breathe, right? So Ukraine does not have a large number of ATACMS missiles. And every time they fire an ATACMS missile, they have to fire that thing at a very important target. You have very few of these missiles. You don't want to waste them. And when you fire them, you're burning your target location. Remember, Russia has AI as well. And so they have people that are looking at where these ATACMS missiles are being fired from, and they're going to try to put together any kind of pattern. So when you choose to launch a missile, you're choosing to burn a location to launch from, and you can never use that location again. So the idea of using an ATACMS missile and burning a very expensive ATACMS missile and burning a location to kill a bunch of beachgoers, why? What's the tactical benefit you get there? So from that, you can pretty much deduce that if those beachgoers were hit by any debris, it was most likely a weapon system that had been intercepted. And as much as I hate to say it, occasionally when you attack a target, if there's civilians near that target, those civilians could be hit by weapons that are being intercepted. Unfortunately, that's just war. It would probably be advisable for you not to vacation in a war zone. That would be kind of step number one, right? Maybe don't do that thing. But the idea of intentionally launching an ATACMS missile at someone for the lulz is that's absolutely absurd, and that's just something that people who've never been in the military, they just don't seem to understand. It's very difficult for them to understand the calculus that's in place when you choose to fire a multi-million-dollar weapon system.
So, in the time that we've had our conversations, if people are interested, they can find another conversation we had about, more thematical disinformation debunking and methods and perspectives you have on that in the description and on screen. But one of the things that obviously happened was the bill passing, $65 or so billion being passed. And we are generally seeing a, shall we say, relaxation in certain restrictions that NATO, the United States particularly, has had over Ukraine's usage of certain equipment in certain ways. First question sort of related to that is how do you feel about it? It's the right thing to do. Obviously, after yesterday probably is. But second, sort of, they're kind of coupled together. But we have seen a significant rise in cross-border strikes by the Ukrainians in and around Belgorod. I'm very curious for your perspectives on that, and if you think that that's a bit of a slippery slope or not.
I don't think it's necessarily a slippery slope. Remember, Russia and China, to some extent, were actively involved in shooting down American aircraft in Vietnam, right? And I don't think the Russians or the Chinese ever said, whoa, we can't do this because America might escalate, right? Like, that never turned into a nuclear war. That never turned into World War III. And you had Chinese trainers and Russian trainers that were shooting SA-2 missiles at American fighter jets. And supposedly some Russian pilots even engaged in combat with American pilots over Hanoi. They were trainers. They were going to teach the Vietnamese how to fly their jets, but I guess they got a little too hands-on education with that. So, that being said, we can't have Ukraine try to fight with their hands tied behind their back. And when people talk about Russia escalating, well, Russia doesn't need an excuse to escalate. They kind of do that naturally, And I think the last thing Russia wants is to get NATO involved. So the whole idea of escalating to the point where NATO gets involved, if NATO gets involved, Russia is in a lot of freaking trouble. I've avoided talking about Ukraine in the sense of win and lose. The war in Ukraine is lose and lose less. Russia's going to lose. Ukraine is going to lose. The question is, who loses less? And if we arm Ukraine and allow them to strike targets inside Russia, Ukraine is still going to lose, but they're going to lose less. And losing less means that Ukraine goes to the negotiating table from a position of strength rather than a position of weakness. That's what lose less looks like, right? So Russia knows that if NATO gets involved, Russia is going to lose. There's not going to be lose and lose less. Russia is going to lose way more, mainly because the U.S. and NATO would take a page out of the first Gulf War. And that would be to conduct an extensive air campaign against units in Russia for weeks or months before rolling in armor and actually kicking them out of Ukraine. And that's just not something Russia wants to deal with. So I don't really see escalation as kind of a valid concern, just because it's within Russia's best interest to keep NATO out of the war.
Yeah, I think it's refreshing that you've said about the lose and lose less. It's something that I try to say, albeit slightly differently, that no one wins from war. It's not a case of win or lose. You don't win. As soon as a war starts, everybody has lost. So I think, and I think some people who obviously we want Ukraine to come out as a sovereign state, but I guess I would just ask you, the feasibility since we last spoke of Ukraine really sort of realistically obtaining all of its equipment, territory back. How realistic is that?
I think that's going to be very difficult to do. And it's not only is it going to be very difficult for Ukraine to win all of its territory back, it's going to be very difficult for Russia to move forward and capture significant amounts of Ukrainian territory. And a lot of that goes back to landmines and the defensive works that have sprung up in southern and eastern Ukraine. The fact is that with such good defensive works and landmines, maneuver warfare is pretty much off the table.
Yeah.
And one of the other issues is that ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, it is so good today through drones that you really can't form anything more than a company. So maybe 12, 14 tanks, 110 infantrymen or so, 100 infantrymen. You can't really form more than a company without creating this massive visual, thermal, and electronic signature. Now, in the old days, before extensive drone ISR, you might be able to get a battalion, maybe a brigade, staged and ready to push and do a breakthrough. But now, if you try to do that, you are going to get the crap HIMARSed out of you. Or you're going to get loitering munitions like the Lancet called down on all of your positions, because Russian ISR is really good and Ukrainian ISR is really good. So they're at parity right now. So really no side can mass enough troops to actually form a breakthrough. The only way troops could actually perform a breakthrough would be if someone's lines collapse because of political reasons, or let's say because Russia, let's say there's Russian troops aren't getting enough food, and so they protest or they say we're not going to fight. Now you have literally a hole in the line, right? Or let's say troops mutiny or they turn on each other.
Yeah.
Something like that, you might be able to break through the front lines, because defeating a minefield actually isn't that hard if nobody's shooting at you. You just bring in the armored bulldozer, you push the landmines out of the way, you bulldoze over the trench. We did that in Iraq. It was trivial. But it was trivial because nobody was shooting at us, or some Iraqis resisted. But for the most part, if nobody's shooting at you, you just bulldoze landmines out of the way, push in the trench, bulldoze that right in, and you break through to the other side. I don't really see that happening unless someone's lines collapse due to political reasons. So I don't really see Ukraine being able to break through and drive all the way to Crimea. What I do see is over the next 2 years, Ukraine being able to take back incremental gains and eventually negotiate the return of their territories from a standpoint of strength instead of a standpoint of weakness. And for the next 40 years, what we see is the Donbass and Crimea essentially become similar to the Sinai Peninsula, where we've had the MFO or KFOR in Kosovo, where there's an international peacekeeping force in those two locations, and they keep the peace between Russia and Ukraine. And there's zones, like in Zone A, you're allowed troops. In Zone B, you're allowed tanks and troops. In Zone C, whatever. So that's kind of what I see. That'll probably happen in the next 2 years.
Right. Okay. So, there's a lot here now. You triggered me to say, I was like, I've got this perfect follow-up question. Then you said something else. I was like, I want to mention that. The wine's not helping either. No, I mean, look, I would say, for me, I guess my first clarification question is, what is a relative position of strength for Ukraine at the negotiating table? As far as I can see, the territorial composition of the war has not changed from between 18 and 20%, most notably after the Ukrainian counteroffensive at the end of 2022. Nothing has changed, And what I find very funny is when you see people who've suddenly become military analysts, i.e. grifters, on the Kremlinite side, who claim that because Russia's gained another field, or Bakhmut has suddenly been taken, a city of 50,000, and how many troops did it, tens of thousands did it cost the Russians? About the same, if not more, you know what I mean, to take in casualty numbers, not only fatality. It's absurd. So what is a position of relative strength for the Ukrainians at the negotiating table? And then I would like to come a little bit more to your idea of a Sinai scenario?
So I would say the position of strength is Ukraine is in a position where it has all of the weapons to blunt any kind of future Russian advance. That is the essential position of strength, where Russia knows that it is
position
not
of
going to be able to
advance.
advance.
Sorry, Ryan, but a position of
Uh-huh.
to prevent advance, but also strikes, as we saw yesterday. Like, how well equipped is it preventatively? If that makes
So
sense.
I would say that Ukraine is never going to be able to defend all of its airspace from Russian missiles. The country is just too big. It's too big. They would need, I think the last estimate was 18 to 24 Patriot batteries to defend their entire country, and that's just not going to happen. I don't know if there's enough batteries in the inventory to fully go over or to fully protect a country like Ukraine. So that one's kind of tough, right? But at the same time, like, what does Russia have to gain by continuing to launch missiles into Ukraine if they know they can't capture any territory? Unless they're doing it just out of spite, which could certainly be a reason, right? So to me, the position of strength is Russia realizes that NATO's political will is strong. They're willing to fund Ukraine with weapon systems that will prevent Russia from making any more gains. Russia realizes that they're throwing good money after bad, trying to get people to, taking thousands of people to take one town. And if we continue to do this, there's going to be a mutiny. So that's what the position of strength looks like. And from that's when you go to the negotiation table and the Russians leave Zaporizhia, and eventually you have some sort of peacekeeping force in the Donbass and Crimea.
Okay, so a little bit on this scenario of yours, because it sounds to me a little bit like I don't know, there's so many, tiny variations of sort of similar ideas, right? We've had, just to name a few ideas, which is a Korean-style DMZ along the line of contact, a buffer zone styled on sort of Cyprus, now your Sinai province, which I feel like is a slight variation where you've got different tiers or whatever zones of sort of rules and restrictions. What could you take us a little bit through more this Sinai example, because it's not one I've heard before, and could you really imagine Russia agreeing, not so much Ukraine, because I think they probably would at the behest of the Americans, but could you really see Russia agreeing to a UN peacekeeping force, quote unquote, in that area or something like that?
Well, it probably wouldn't be a UN peacekeeping force. It would most likely be a peacekeeping force from developing nations. But here's kind of the deal with the Sinai Peninsula. So on the Sinai Peninsula, essentially Israel gave up all of the Sinai Peninsula, which they won in 1967 during the Six-Day War. They essentially gave up all the Sinai. They gave that back to Egypt. And in return, we created a peacekeeping force, I think it was composed of 13 different nations. The United States was part of this peacekeeping force. Like Norway, Japan was part of this force. France, Italy, Fiji, Colombia, Uruguay, a number of other nations contributed troops to this peacekeeping force. It's probably one of the most successful peacekeeping missions ever. And it's not run by the UN. It's run by a separate organization, the MFO, the Multinational Force and Observers. And this contingent of troops sits on the border between Egypt and Israel, and they make sure everyone's following the peace treaty and everyone's being honest. So that I could see an MFO-like organization being established in Crimea and in the Donbass. And that MFO organization, that could be composed of maybe countries from South America, countries from Asia, maybe, hey, let's get Serbia in on this too. Serbia is fairly Russian friendly, and I would love to see the Lazar actually being deployed. I think that's a fascinating weapon. Serbia, they have their own homegrown arms industry, and some of their equipment is actually pretty darn good. Just nobody wants to buy it. So I could see something like that. I could see some, I don't want to say third world nations, but non-aligned nations from South America, perhaps Africa, perhaps the Asia. Actually, the Philippines would be a good choice for that. So Malaysia, that would be a darn good choice. Nigeria has a really good military. Brazil, they have a pretty darn good military. So does Colombia. Those would all be good choices to run any kind of peacekeeping force, inside of the Donbass and Crimea.
Okay, interesting. No, I've not heard that version. For all my nerdiness of liking to sort of think I know all the acronyms and shorthands for international organizations, never heard of the MFO. So could you sort of say like a bit like the Kenyan law enforcement group entity that has gone out to Haiti to try to stabilize the country? I know very different in that it's not so comprehensive as the MFO, but sort of like another country, a non-aligned nation that has decided to go across the globe and sort of take a lead in international security and stabilization processes or something.
Yeah, that would be an excellent example. Yes.
Did I impress you? I hope could I say that's a small win for me that I sort of was like, that's good. So, okay, so you mentioned Mutiny. And one of the things that we saw a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was very interesting, was the Dagestani destabilization. So for people context, Dagestan is part of Russia. It's a bit like Chechnya, and it's got a Muslim majority. And there have been movements, as we saw at the airport in 2023, about a year ago. Sort of people tried to take over the airport out of protest for being treated in a sort of second-class citizen way, which they often are because they're not Christian. And Putin, well, should we say that Dagestan and Chechnya have been center holds for recruitment for the war in Ukraine? I don't know, Ryan, if you were following that, but just coming back to what you mentioned a few minutes ago about the idea of a political crisis or an internal situation. Yeah. What's your prognosis on Russia's, could we see such a thing actually happen? I mean, let's all talk about the Wagner mutiny last year, attempted mutiny last year. Very curious for your thoughts about this. The longer it goes on, could we see that growing and growing?
So there's a non-zero chance that something like that could happen, right? That's kind of the... So okay, Russia's a big country, and there's always that one person who, I'm sure you've heard of the term prison rules before, right? And that's yes. Kind of like, that's kind of Russia's deal. That a lot of Russian military culture kind of comes from their prison culture of right. Guys who, they might makes right, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you're looking at how Russia might actually behave if there's a coup, I guarantee you there are people in Russia who are looking at Vladimir Putin and they're going, this guy is 72 years old. He's not going to be in power forever. No. And we need a plan for what might happen, once he gets sick. There is no designated successor, right? I mean, who is the designated successor for Vladimir Putin? Because I can't tell you. I don't know. And that's kind of dangerous, right? Because if that's when problems start to happen. When nobody's appointed a designated successor, then everyone is kind of like out for themselves. Like I want to have a seat when the music stops. I don't know if they play musical chairs where you're from, but you want to make sure... In America, at least, there's a game you play in kindergarten called musical chairs, where you put on a song and everybody has to walk around this set of chairs. And when the music stops, you have to sit down. If you don't have a seat, you're out. And then they take away another seat. And then there's musical chairs. So everyone wants a chair when that music stops, right? And if that isn't the case, people are going to align themselves with groups that will make sure that they have a chair when the music stops. So, Putin might be able to keep a handle on this for a certain amount of time. But once he gets older or once he gets sick, that's going to be an issue. And, I would say I don't want to get into actual percentages, but there is a non-zero chance that there could be some sort of coup or some sort of change of power where people suddenly decide, you know what, I really don't like my situation right now, I think I can do a better job running Russia, or at least I want to get rid of President Putin so that way I will have a seat once the music stops. So that's probably the
Yeah,
best answer that I could give you.
no, I think it's a fair answer. Putin, by most estimations, Russia is more my wheelhouse in terms of regional experience, and most I think reckon he'll be, he's going to run again or he'll win it again, and then he'll be in power at least until 2036. I think that's when there is a slight
Yeah.
change in the constitution, which might mean that. But he'll be, what's that? That's 12 years. He'll be 83. And there's a lot of speculation about how he's changed. There's a chap called Mark Galotti who talks about this sort of different phases Putin's been in since he's been in power, and I think it's quite a pertinent way of looking at it. He's changed over the time. The world around him has changed and has changed him, and his general perception of sort of the West and his approach to things. Your comment about might is right is so pertinent because it's, I think, normalized the return to use of hard power as the primary go-to instead of diplomacy and soft power, which I think is very disturbing. And what's the precedents that it sets for China and Taiwan, or any of them, even Venezuela and Guyana a few months ago when there were concerns around that. But shifting from one leader to another, we've had a consequential presidential debate. I don't really know. I don't know. I don't want to sort of cloak the question too much. What did you think of the presidential debate? What did you think about Biden? And what do you think about Trump's response over it? Because in the past few days, we've had an idea of what Trump's relationship to NATO might look like. At least I can send you the article.
So, believe it or not, I did not watch the presidential debate.
Oh,
I I have a finite amount of bandwidth in my life, and I was dating this. I guess I don't know what. I have a friend that I see once in a while who lives down in Virginia Beach.
Okay,
Right?
all right.
And because I can't say I'm dating her, but so I have this friend. And she once asked me,
enjoying each other's company.
Yeah, and she once asked me like how come you don't know that there was some question, some political question, like how do you not know about whatever? And I said, how many road wheels does an M1 tank have? Well, it has 14. You got 7 road wheels to distribute the weight. You have 1 return wheel, because that's what I'm thinking of, like literally all the time. I'm looking at different kinds of equipment and tactics and new weapon systems. And, the person who's in power, I don't want to say that's irrelevant. It's probably relevant for Peter Zion. But at the level that I usually look at things, like, it doesn't really matter who's in power. And I know that might sound kind of crazy. It doesn't matter if President Trump's in power, President Biden's in power. Let me tell you something. President Trump is going to say what he needs to say to get elected, and President Biden's going to say what he needs to say to get elected. And after they actually get elected, then they're going to do what they need to do. And both of those guys know that Russia coming out on top in a conflict with Ukraine would be bad. And there's 2 reasons for this. The first is that President Biden knows that Russia coming out on top with a conflict in Ukraine would be bad because he is a cold warrior, right? Like he grew up, he cut his teeth in politics while the Soviet Union was the main enemy. So that's number 1. And number 2, what is President Trump's biggest threat? What does he look at when he looks around the world? What does President Trump consider America's biggest threat? China, right? You hear him say it all the time. China, China, China. So President Trump knows that the best way of preventing China from invading Taiwan is to stand firm with Ukraine. Remember, President Trump was the first president that sent lethal aid to Ukraine. That he sent Javelin missiles. President Obama sent night vision devices and blankets. That's great. You need blankets. You need night vision devices. But you can't win a war with blankets alone. President Trump sent lethal aid. And he knows that if we stand together on Ukraine, we're going to stand together when it comes to Taiwan. And that's the big threat. That's the one thing President Trump is worried about. He's I don't say he has a healthy respect for China's military capabilities.
But Ryan,
And so I don't really think it matters who becomes president, because both of those people know that supporting Ukraine is ultimately going to show China that aggression is not going to stand among the free nations of the world.
sure. I mean, yeah, I agree with you, but just to hammer home this point a little bit, because he wants to re-evaluate, shall we say, the relationship with, is that whiskey or is that apple juice?
This is whiskey. I got more right here.
Okay, right. Oh, very good. Oh, okay. I need to get my bottle of wine and share. No, but like, let's hammer home this point a little bit more, because like, sure, he wants to show strength and he wants to ensure that Xi Jinping doesn't feel that he can get away with whatever he wants in X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, there are debates about what China wants to do. Do they want to reshape the world order? Do they want to reform it? You know, people might be like, what's the difference? There is a difference. Trust me, I follow great politics. But anyway, point I'm making is he wants to reevaluate the relationship with the United States to NATO. The realism is that he's probably not going to withdraw from NATO completely because it's too complicated, and also probably actually be more costly for the US than not. And to your point about China, but he wants to severely gut or defund the alliance, right? And still, is that not going to be in itself a illustration, an indication, a signal to the Russians or the Kremlin, to whoever it is, that they can go ahead and really begin to hammer home even more than they already have done in the past couple of years? You know, is it still not? Is his still own strategy still scary enough? Or what he wants to do with the United States, isn't that concerning enough for you? I'm just curious.
You know, presidents, believe it or not, do not have a lot of power. And that's something like a lot of people, especially outside of the U.S., don't seem to understand. That unless you take a look at President Obama. When President Obama became president in 2008, he basically took a 2-year victory lap, right? And they really didn't do anything. Actually, they did do one thing, which really made me mad, is that they increased the excise tax on cigars by a nickel per stick, which kind of made me a little upset. But presidents don't really have that much power. So in order for a president to actually have power, they need to be elected. And then in Congress, in America, we have 2 houses of Congress, the Senate and the House. The Senate and the House also have to be the same party as the president. And if you have all 3 of those organizations, then you might be able to get things done. But you might also have people who can use procedural stuff to make trouble. So I don't know if you recall that about 2 years ago in America, we tried to elect what we call the Speaker of the House. Now, England has a Speaker of the House.
Yes,
but
it's McCarthy. Yes.
Yes. And
yeah.
So you essentially had one American political party fighting with each other to determine who the next Speaker of the House would be. So you might say, oh, President Trump wants to defund NATO. He wants to do this. He wants to do that. I'm sure he wants to do a lot of things. What this person might actually be able to do might be a heck of a lot different than what he's actually able to do. Because there will be people who are saying, hey, all right, what's in it for me? You know what? You say you wanted to fund NATO, but I needed I wanted that new sewer plant in my district. How come that hasn't happened yet? I'm going to hold this bill up until I get my new sewer plant. So I wouldn't be too worried about things changing all that drastically.
Okay, one last challenge on you on this, though. But because Trump's use of the national executive powers, right? The use of what's happened in the Supreme Court. The conversation we just had with Jake, a few days before we're recording this with you now. Jake is very concerned about the Supreme Court ruling about the, shall we say, ultimate power, or I can't think of the right word. Probably it's the wine again. But the fact that the president is almost sort of escapable from the law, right? He's very concerned about that, and I know how much you guys are on the same page about so many things. So, why you don't share his same fears about the sort of reach of the U.S. president?
guess because I'm a little bit older. I'm almost 50, and I've seen this before. And I think that one of the fears that the Supreme Court really has is that what they are afraid that a sitting president might get out of office and then be indicted by another president for things that were legal to do in office. And if you have that specter of a lawsuit or jail time hanging over your head because of things that you did in office legitimately, then it might be better to codify that presidents are immune when they make certain decisions than to have a president afraid to lead, and because of what might happen when he actually leaves office. So I think that's kind of the way the Supreme Court was going there. Our president still isn't a king, but lately it seems like American society has gotten a little more litigious. And what you don't want is a president doing things in office where he maybe had to make hard choices. And then once he leaves office, people sue him or try to put him in jail. So who's going to want to be president after that, right? No one. No one's going to want to be. At least nobody good is going to want to be president. So I think the idea from the Supreme Court was that this immunity doesn't just protect the oncoming president, it protects the current president. Because let's say that people think that President Trump is a tyrant. Well, let's say he defeats President Biden. What if he really does try to bring President Biden up on charges for doing this, that, or the other? And the charges might be false, so there might be a little bit of evidence for it, but not so much that a prosecutor really would. Well, now he has immunity, right? For things that he did in office as long as they were office related. So in some ways, I think this is good moving forward because it kind of gives the president room to breathe and to lead and not have to worry about jail time hanging over his head. This doesn't mean the president can't walk up to someone in Lafayette Park and murder him and not face consequences for that, right? But for things that the president is doing during his course of office, he can't be put on trial later. And that's something that you would do in a banana republic. And that's not what America's about.
But my last question for you, Ryan, in this segment is what should people pay attention to, in your opinion, for the rest of this year or in the next short to medium term when it comes to the war in Ukraine and Russia?
Wow, that's a really good question. What should people pay attention to?
Well, aside from not the disinformation, what should people look out for that Ryan Macbeth gets gets its seal of approval from you? In the sense
look for the F-16s. That's going to be. I mean, I hate to use the word game changer. Everyone uses that word. Oh, this is going to be a game changer. But if you get enough game changers in one place, then you're going to change the game.
Okay.
And I think that the F-16 is going to be a big one. That's definitely going to be a big one because the F-16 is basically it's a 4-threat weapon. Mm-hmm. With the AMRAAM missile, it can take back the skies. So that's number one. It doesn't quite have the same range as the Russian R-37 missile, but it's close. It's close, and it's going to force Russia to operate even further back. It could also help. It could help force Russia to launch its glide bombs from further back in its territory, reducing the range of its glide bombs. The second thing the F-16 is going to do is it's going to fire the HARM anti-radiation missile. What's kind of neat about the HARM is that you can tune that to different radio frequencies. And with the F-16, you can launch that down the actual beam if you get illuminated. So currently, with the HARM anti-radiation missile that they installed on the MiG-29, that missile needs to be calibrated to the exact target they're going to shoot at. And they do that with a laptop on the ground. They program that in, upload it, and then the MiG-29 flies. They fire their jury-rigged HARM missile at the radar system. Well, once they get the F-16 has the capability of shooting back dynamically. So it might detect that radar, go, oh, there's a radar. America calls it wild weasel. We actually actively hunt for the SAM systems. We fly and we go, okay, light me up. And as soon as they light me up, you fire a missile down that beam. You can also fire those HARM missiles at jammers. What are jammers? Jammers are emitting electromagnetic radiation. What does the HARM do? It's an anti-radiation missile. So now you're going to be able to hit not only the radar sets, but the jammers. So now you have to move all of those things back even further. Now, with the jammers out of the way, you have the third thing that the F-16 can do, and that's drop the JDAM-ER, the Joint Direct Attack Munition Extended Range, which are America's version of glide bombs. And these things are precision weapons. With the GPS jammers taken out, they'll be a lot more precise than they would be with just inertial guidance. And now you're taking out command centers, now you're taking out logistical hubs. And then the fourth thing is Ukraine will be able to use the Harpoon anti-ship missile mated to the F-16 to take out any further missile launching platforms in the Black Sea. So look for the F-16. That's going to be a really big deal once it hits the ground.
Not just maybe not a game changer, but at least a sea change, because we're talking about the maritime air. That was a very a good old pun on my part. Ryan Macbeth, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us in part one. This is Ryan Macbeth. He's an intel analyst, software architect, a disinfo debunker, and a prominent YouTuber. Everyone, if you haven't already, go check out Ryan's channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, give it a like, give it a subscribe, hit that bell, and give it a share to anyone else who you think might enjoy the conversation. And I'll see you all in the next one. Wish you peace of mind. Take care.